The smell of the lab at 4 a.m. is specific. It's a mix of ozone from the server racks, burnt coffee from the pot that hasn't been washed in a week, and the stale, recycled air of desperation. That was my perfume for the last 4 years. I lived in that smell. I breathed it. I practically became it. I was sitting in my usual spot, corner desk, behind a wall of monitors. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand. My back was a solid knot of tension. On the screen in front of me, a progress bar crawled forward. 98%, 99%. Then, it blinked red. Error, segmentation fault. Again, I slammed my forehead onto the desk, hard. The thud echoed in the empty lab, just me and the humming machines. Me and the failure. Kenji, you're close, Professor Vance had told me yesterday. He'd clapped a hand on my shoulder. His hand was warm, manicured, smelling of expensive sanitizer. But the data is just messy. It's not elegant yet. Clean it up. We can't publish garbage. Garbage, that was his favorite word for my life's work. I sighed and sat up. I needed a break. I needed to see something other than code that refused to compile. I pulled out my phone. It was buzzing. Not a text. Not a call. Just news alerts. A dozen of them. All from tech blogs, financial news, mainstream outlets. Tech giant IPO. The billion-dollar algorithm. The future of biocomputing. I didn't care about stocks. I was a grad student living on a stipend that barely covered my rent and my ramen addiction. But the name caught my eye. The ticker symbol. VNCR. Vance. My stomach did a weird flip, like I'd missed a step on a staircase. I clicked the link to CNBC. A live stream loaded. The volume was off, but the caption was screaming in bold white letters, Wall Street's newest darling. And there he was, Professor Julian Vance, my advisor, the man who told me yesterday that my work was garbage. He wasn't in his usual tweed jacket and jeans. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my entire tuition. He stood on a balcony overlooking the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. He held a wooden gavel. He was grinning. That wide, charismatic grin that made undergrads swoon and donors open their checkbooks. I turned the volume up. His voice filled the quiet lab. I wasn't easy, Vance was saying. He looked humble. He looked like a visionary. Great ideas never are. I spent nights awake, just staring at the ceiling, trying to crack the protein folding problem. And then, one night, it just came to me. The cascade sequence, a way to simulate biological evolution in milliseconds. The cascade sequence. I froze. My blood turned to ice water. The room started to spin. The cascade sequence, the reporter repeated. She looked impressed. And this is the core of VanCortech? This is what allows you to predict cancer mutations with 99% accuracy. Exactly, Vance nodded. He looked straight into the camera, straight at me. I wrote the core kernel in a fever dream over a weekend. It was just pure inspiration. Sometimes the science just speaks to you. He wrote it. My hand started to shake. Tremors ran down my arms. I couldn't stop them. I dropped my phone. It clattered onto the desk, face up. Vance was still talking, still smiling. I wrote it. I looked at my computer monitor. I minimized the failed simulation window. I opened a folder labeled archive_2021. I opened a file named cascade_v4test.py. I scrolled down to line 402. There it was. The cascade sequence, a block of Python code I had written 3 years ago. I remembered writing it. I remembered the song playing on Spotify when I finally cracked the logic. Lo-fi hill-hop beats to study to. I remembered the taste of the energy drink I was chugging. I remembered showing it to Vance the next morning, eyes bright with excitement. He had looked at it, frowned, and tossed the printout on his messy desk. It's too heavy, Kenji. It's clunky. Focus on the literature review. Leave the coding for now. He buried it. He told me it was useless. He kept me here, in this lab, fixing typos in his grant proposals, while he took my code, polished it, packaged it, and sold it to Wall Street. I looked back at the phone. The bell rang. The crowd cheered. Confetti rained down on Vance. The ticker at the bottom of the screen updated. VNCR, $45. VNCR, $52.50. The NCR, $68. The market cap soared. 2 billion, 3 billion. Professor Vance was a billionaire. I was eating instant noodles that expired last month. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. It wasn't a happy laugh. It sounded like something breaking. It sounded like a car crash. I laughed until I was choking. I laughed until tears were streaming down my face, hot and angry. He stole it. He stole everything. My nights, my youth, my brain. He peeled my mind open like an orange and ate the fruit, and now he was tossing the rind, me, into the trash. I looked around the lab, the posters on the wall, the expensive equipment bought with grant money I helped him get. It all felt like a set, a fake room built to keep me occupied, a hamster wheel. You're a student, he had said once during a heated meeting about credit. You're here to learn. I'm here to lead. I stopped laughing. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The nausea hit me then. I grabbed the trash can from under my desk and retched. Nothing came up but bile, acid, pure bitterness. I wet my mouth with the back of my hand. I stared at the code on my screen. The timestamp on the file, October 12th, 2021. Proof. I had proof. But then I looked at the phone again. Vance was shaking hands with the CEO of a major pharma company. He was untouchable. He was a god now, and God and I was way more than souls I knew he would be. He probably expected me to fade away, to quit, to be crushed by the weight of my own failure. He expected Kenji the quiet student, Kenji the pushover, Kenji who apologized when someone else bumped into him. He didn't know Kenji the architect. He didn't know that I knew every line of that code. I knew its strengths, and more importantly, I knew its weaknesses. I knew where the bodies were buried, because I was the one who dug the graves. I sat back down. I cracked my knuckles. The shaking stopped. A cold, hard clarity replaced the panic. I didn't close the file. I didn't delete it. I opened a new terminal window. The cursor blinked. A steady, rhythmic pulse, waiting for a command. Vance wanted the cascade sequence. Fine, he could have it. But he forgot one thing about complex systems. If you change one variable, just one tiny, insignificant variable in the foundation, the whole structure doesn't just bend, it collapses. But let me back up. Before I burn his billion-dollar empire to the ground, you need to know how a shy kid from the suburbs ended up holding the match. To understand how I got here, you have to understand the cult of Julian Vance. In the world of computational biology, he wasn't just a professor, he was a rock star. He had the cover of Nature every other year. He had the TED Talks. He had that silver fox hair and a way of speaking that made you feel like you were part of a revolution. My parents, first-generation immigrants who sacrificed everything to put me through school, were obsessed with him. Kenji. My father would say, pointing at a newspaper clipping of Vance at a White House summit, "This is a man of honor. Work for him, learn from him, become like him." I was 24 when I got into his lab. I felt like I'd won the lottery. I remember the first day walking into the building, the glass walls, the $10 million server arrays, the air of quiet, expensive intelligence. Vance met me in his office. It was a corner suite with a view of the quad. He didn't shake my hand. He grabbed my forearm, looking me dead in the eye. "Panji Sato," he said, his voice a rich baritone. "The kid who optimized the folding algorithm while he was still a junior. I've been watching you. You have a rare gift for seeing the patterns in the noise. Most people see chaos. You see architecture." I blushed. I actually blushed. I was a naive kid who spent more time with compilers than people. I thought I had found a mentor. I thought I had found a father figure in science. "I don't just want a student, Kenji," he continued, leaning back in his leather chair. "I want a partner. We're going to map the human proteome. We're going to make cancer a footnote in history books. Are you in?" I would have signed my soul away right then. In a way, I did. The first year was a honeymoon. Vance was brilliant at the big picture. He'd sketch out these wild, ambitious theories on his whiteboard, massive, sweeping ideas about how proteins interact. My job was to turn those sketches into reality. I was the one who actually wrote the code, I was the one who sat in the basement of the server farm, debugging at 3 a.m. because the simulation crashed after 400 hours of compute time. He called me the engine. "How's the engine running today, Kenji?" He'd ask, popping into the lab for 5 minutes before heading to a lunch with some VC firm or university board members. "Running well, Professor." "I fixed the memory leak in the recursive loop," I'd say, looking up with bloodshot eyes. "Good, good. Send me the source code. I want to tweak the visualization for the board meeting." That was the pattern. I did the work. He tweaked it. I didn't mind at first. That's how academia works, right? The PI gets the glory. The grad student gets the degree. I was playing the game. I was paying my dues. I thought there was a light at the end of the tunnel. But then the tunnel started getting longer. In my 3rd year, I had enough data for my thesis. The cascade sequence, the core logic I'd been building since day 1 was working. It was beautiful. It was a piece of software that could predict molecular outcomes faster than anything on the market. I wrote the draft, 300 pages of rigorous, peer-reviewed gold. I handed it to Vance. I remember the weight of that paper in my hands. It felt like my life's work. He didn't read it. He put it on a stack of other papers and didn't look at it for 3 months. Every time I asked, he had an excuse. "I'm traveling, Kenji. The grant cycle is killing me, Kenji. We need one more set of simulations to be sure, Kenji." Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the lab changed. It felt less like a research facility and more like a corporate startup. Vance started bringing in consultants. Men in sharp suits who didn't know a peptide from a pepperoni pizza. They'd sit in his office for hours with the blinds drawn. One day, I walked into the break room and saw Vance talking to a guy in a Patagonia vest. "The intellectual property is clean," Vance was saying, his voice low. "The student is a workhorse. He doesn't care about the business side. He's just happy to have his name on a paper." "And the code?" the suit asked. "Can we scale it?" "It's mine," Vance said. "I designed the architecture. He's just the typist." Typist. The word hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, frozen, holding my empty coffee mug. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I wanted to walk in there and scream. I wanted to tell that suit that I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for 3 years. I wanted to show him the thousands of lines of code that Vance couldn't even explain if his life depended on it. But I didn't. I was Kenji, the quiet one, the model student. I turned around and walked back to my desk. I told myself I misheard. I told myself he was just playing the game to get more funding for us. I was a master of self-delusion. Vance started getting more demanding. He wanted the code pushed to a private GitHub repository. For security, he said. He changed the passwords. He restricted my access to certain modules, my own modules. "Why, Professor?" I asked during one of our rare one-on-ones. He looked at me with a coldness I'd never seen before. The rockstar mask slipped for a second. "Because, Kenji, you're getting distracted. You're worrying about the why when you should be worrying about the how. Just keep the engine running. I'll handle the steering." I felt the first real spark of resentment then. It was a small, hot coal in the pit of my stomach. I started noticing things, small things. Vance was suddenly very wealthy. He bought a house in the hills. He started wearing watches that cost more than my car. He stopped coming to the lab entirely, communicating only through short, cryptic emails. "Update the kernel. Send the latest training weights. Delete the local backups. We need to space on the drive. Delete the backups." That was the red flag I shouldn't have ignored. But I was so deep in the sunk cost fallacy. I had 4 years invested. I needed him to sign off on my defense. Without his signature, I was nothing. I was a dropout with a pile of useless data. He knew that. He held my future in his manicured hands, and he squeezed it whenever he felt me pulling away. I remember my 28th birthday. My mom called me, crying, "Kenji, when are you finished? Your father is getting old. He wants to see you succeed. He wants to see you as a doctor. Soon, Mom. Just a few more months." I lied to her because I had to believe the lie myself. I went to Vance's office that afternoon. I didn't knock. I walked in. He was on the phone laughing. He looked at me, annoyed, and held up a finger. "Wait." I waited. For 10 minutes. He hung up and sighed. "What is it now, Kenji?" I'm in the middle of a very important acquisition. I want a date, Julian, I said. I didn't call him Professor. I saw him flinch. I want a date for my PhD defense. The committee is ready. The paper is finished. There is no more data to collect. Vance stood up. He walked over to the window and looked out at the students walking below. He looked like he was mourning something. Kenji, 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 he whispered. You're so impatient. You're a brilliant coder, but you don't understand the timing of the world. The work isn't ready. It needs more polish. Polish? It's the most advanced biosimulation in the world. You know it is. You're using it. He turned around. His face was like stone. I'm the judge of when it's ready. And right now, you're not defending. Not this semester. Maybe not the next. You're holding me hostage, I said, my voice trembling. I'm keeping you focused, he countered. Now go back to the lab. I need the V5.2 kernel optimized by Monday. There's a demonstration coming up. A very big one. I left his office feeling like I was walking through water. I felt heavy. I felt old. I went back to the lab. I sat in my chair. The ozone smell, the coffee smell. I realized then that the light at the end of the tunnel wasn't an exit. It was a train, and Vance was the conductor, and he was planning to run right over me. But as I looked at the code, my code, I realized something else. Vance was a visionary. He was a salesman. He was a thief. But he wasn't a programmer. He saw the cascade sequence as a product, a black box that produced miracles. He didn't understand the guts of it. He didn't understand the delicate, terrifying balance of the logic. He didn't know that I hadn't just built an engine. I had built a nervous system, and I was the only one who knew where the nerves were. I started typing, not the optimization he asked for, something else. A logic bomb is a crude term. What I was building was more like a genetic defect. Something that looks perfectly healthy for generations until one specific rare condition occurs. Then, and only then, the DNA starts to unravel itself from the inside out. I worked through the night. I felt a strange, cold peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't working for Vance. I wasn't working for my PhD. I was working for myself. I was building a trap. And I was going to make sure that when Julian Vance finally stepped into the spotlight, the floor wouldn't just creak. It would vanish. The next 6 months were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Vance didn't even know he was a combatant. I became the perfect typist. I stopped arguing about defense dates. I stopped asking for credit. I became a ghost in the machine, arriving at the lab before dawn and leaving long after the janitors had finished their rounds. To Vance, I looked defeated. I looked like a dog that had finally stopped barking after being kicked too many times. He loved it. That's the spirit, Kenji, he'd say, stopping by my desk once a week. He started dressing even better. Bespoke Italian suits, shoes that cost more than my annual rent. He looked like he was vibrating with a secret energy. Efficiency is up. The kernel is looking lean. I knew you had it in you to push through that creative block. I just nodded, staring at the screen. My eyes were bloodshot, but not from failure. They were bloodshot from the sheer complexity of the Kona. Easter egg I was weaving into the architecture. You see, the cascade sequence relied on a specific set of recursive loops to simulate protein folding. It was a delicate balance of processing power and predictive logic. What I was doing was surgical. I was inserting a piece of code. I called it the ghost. That was designed to remain dormant. It would pass every stress test. It would pass every diagnostic. It would even pass a line-by-line audit by anyone who didn't spend 10,000 hours building the original framework. The ghost was programmed to trigger only when the simulation reached a specific computational load, exactly 99.2%. Full-scale environmental stress test. That was the kind of simulation you only ran for big demonstrations, the kind where you wanted to show off the maximum potential of the software to a room full of billionaires. When it triggered, it wouldn't just crash the program. A crash is obvious. A crash looks like a bug. No, the ghost was more elegant. It would begin to subtly hallucinate. It would start injecting garbage data into the results, but it would do so while maintaining a perfectly professional-looking interface. It would claim the simulation was a success while displaying results that were biologically impossible, monstrous, nonsensical protein structures that would make any actual scientists realize the entire platform was a fraud. While I built the trap, Vance was busy building his empire. The lab was now crawling with advisors from the tech world. They didn't even look at me. I was just part of the furniture. I'd overhear their conversations in the hallway while I pretended to change the toner in the printer. "The IPO is set for Q3, a woman in a gray blazer said one afternoon. "The valuation is hovering around $4 billion. If the live demo holds up, we're looking at a 40% jump on day one. "Vance is the key," a man replied. "He's the face. The visionary academic angle is selling like crazy. People want to believe in the genius professor who cracked the code in his sleep." I stood by the printer, the warm smell of ozone and paper filling my lungs. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to lean against the wall. $4 billion. Built on the back of a grad student who was currently worried about his $12 phone bill. Vance started getting sloppy with his arrogance. He stopped even pretending the work was academic. One day, he called me into his office, which was now filled with expensive modern art and a literal gold-plated espresso machine. "Kenji, I need you to sign some NDAs," he said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the desk. "And this. It's a standard intellectual property waiver for the university. Since you used lab resources for the cascade logic, the university technically owns the patent, which they've graciously licensed to my private venture." I looked at the papers. It was a total surrender. If I signed this, I was officially signing away any claim to my own brain. "And my PhD, Julian?" I asked. My voice was flat. "Empty. The committee is satisfied with the progress," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "We'll schedule the defense for, let's say, 2 weeks after the IPO. Once the noise has settled, it's for your own good, Kenji. You don't want the media circus distracting you from your academic achievement. It was the ultimate lie. He was going to use me until the money was in his bank account, and then he was going to disappear into the stratosphere, leaving me with a degree that he'd probably try to claim credit for anyway." "I'll sign," I said. I signed every page. I watched his eyes light up with predatory glee. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd finally broken the last bit of resistance in the workhorse. As I walked out of the office, I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. I had no legal recourse now. I had no parents who could help me. I had no money for lawyers. All I had was the terminal. All I had was the code. That night, I went to the server room, the heart of the lab. It was a cold, loud room where the blue lights of the racks blinked like the eyes of 1,000 mechanical insects. I logged into the master branch of the Vancore Tech core kernel. Vance had changed the passwords, but he was a man of ego. His password was his favorite vintage wine, followed by the year he got tenure. It took me 3 minutes to guess it. I uploaded the final version of the ghost. I sat there for a long time, the freezing air of the server room numbing my skin. I thought about the 4 years I'd spent here. I thought about the birthdays I'd missed. I thought about my father's face when I told him I was almost done for the 100th time. I realized that Vance wasn't just stealing my work. He was stealing my time. He was stealing the years of my life I could never get back. He was treating my existence like a raw material to be mined and discarded. A small part of me, the part that still loved science, the part that still believed in the purity of the lab, wanted to stop. It felt like a betrayal of the craft to sabotage a program. But then I remembered Vance's voice on the news. I wrote it in a fever dream. The science was already dead. He had murdered it the moment he turned it into a scam. I wasn't the one destroying the work. I was just ensuring that the lie didn't survive the truth. Over the next week, the pressure reached a boiling point. The university was buzzing. Everyone knew Vance was about to become the richest man in academia. There were posters for the Vancore Tech pre-defense seminar everywhere. It was a gala event masquerading as a scientific presentation. Vance was rarely in the lab now. He was doing interviews for Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He stopped calling me the engine. He started calling me Kenji, my talented assistant, in front of guests. Assistant. I whispered to myself as I watched him walk a group of investors through the lab. They looked at me like I was a piece of high-end equipment, useful but replaceable. The day before the demo, Vance came to my desk. He looked stressed, his face pale under his tan. Kenji, the simulation for tomorrow, it has to be perfect. We're doing a live run of the full proteome mapping. The CEO of Pfizer is going to be in the front row. The NASDAQ cameras will be rolling. I've optimized the load-bearing modules, Professor, I said. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't blink. It will be a performance no one will ever forget. Good, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. His hand was shaking slightly. For the first time, I saw the fear in him. He knew he didn't understand the machine he was selling. He was a pilot who didn't know how the engine worked, flying a plane into a storm. Don't let me down, kid. There's a big bonus in it for you once the stock clears. I'm sure there is, I said. I watched him walk away. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. He was so focused on the money, so blinded by the glare of the spotlight, that he didn't notice the smell of smoke. I stayed in the lab that night. I didn't sleep. I watched the clocks. I watched the progress bars. I watched the stock market pre-market indicators. The stage was set. The audience was arriving. The rock star was ready for his final act. And I was just the guy in the wings, holding the rope that was about to drop the chandelier. The morning of the pre-defense seminar felt less like a scientific milestone and more like a coronation. The university's grand hall had been transformed. Gone were the dusty chalkboards and the smell of old floor wax. In their place were massive LED screens, sleek white podiums, and a catering crew serving hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I arrived early, not because I was excited, but because I had to be the one to set up the Kona technical environment. To the world, I was the loyal roadie for the rock star. I was the guy crawling under the stage to check the Ethernet cables while Vance was backstage getting his makeup touched up for the cameras. I felt like I was moving through a dream or a nightmare. I looked at the guest list on the clipboard by the door. It was a who's who of the people who owned the world. Venture capitalists from Sand Hill Road, CEOs of pharmaceutical giants, the dean of the university, looking smug because his endowment was about to explode. And then I saw them. My parents. They were standing near the back of the hall, looking completely out of place. My father was wearing his good suit, the one he'd bought for my high school graduation 10 years ago. It was a bit too big for him now. He looked smaller, older. My mother was clutching her purse with both hands, looking around at the opulence with a mix of awe and terror. I felt a lump in my throat so thick I could barely breathe. I hadn't invited them. I didn't want them here for this. But then I remembered, Vance. He must have sent them an invite, not out of kindness, but as a final power move. A way to show them and me that he was the one who had brought their son to the finish line. I walked over to them. Mom, Dad, what are you doing here? My mother's face lit up. She reached out and smoothed the lapel of my wrinkled lab coat. Kenji! Professor Vance sent us a car. He said today is the day your work changes the world. He said we should be here to see his brightest protege receive his honors. My father nodded, his eyes misty. He told us you were like a son to him, Kenji. He said he couldn't have built Vancouver without your assistance. The way he said the word assistance, with such pride, as if it were a title of nobility, broke something inside me. They truly believed he was my benefactor. They thought this was my moment. They didn't realize they were standing in a room built on my stolen life, watching a man prepare to sell my soul for $1 billion. Go sit down, okay? I whispered. I couldn't look them in the eye. I have to check the servers. I hurried away before the tears could start. I ducked into the darkened control booth at the back of the hall. My laptop was already plugged into the main feed. The cascade sequence was loaded. The interface was beautiful, a 3D rendering of a human cell pulsing with neon light. Vance walked onto the stage. The applause was deafening. It wasn't the polite clapping of academics, it was the roar of investors who smelled blood in the water. Vance bathed in it. He raised his hands, a humble smile plastered on his face. "Today," he began, his voice echoing with practiced gravitas, "we don't just talk about science. We talk about the end of disease. We talk about the moment humanity finally learned to speak the language of the gods." I watched him on my monitor. He was incredible. If I didn't know better, I would have believed him too. He spent the next 20 minutes spinning a narrative of his discovery. He spoke about the fever dream again. He spoke about the lonely nights in the lab. He never mentioned my name once to the audience. I was the team. I was the infrastructure. Then came the moment that truly broke me. "Before we begin the live demonstration," Vance said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "I want to address the skeptics. They said the cascade logic couldn't scale. They said a single mind couldn't map the complexity of a proteome in real time. Well, I've always enjoyed proving the world wrong." He turned toward the screen. "Kenji, if you would, initiate the full-scale environmental stress test. Let's show them the future." He said my name. He said it with such casual, condescending affection. It was a command. I looked at the code. My hand hovered over the enter key. This was it. This was the point of no return. If I hit this key, the simulation would start. It would run perfectly for about 10 minutes, long enough for the stock market to open, long enough for the initial buy orders to flood in, and then, at the 99.2% mark, the ghost would wake up. But I hesitated. I looked at my parents in the third row. They were leaning forward, my father's hand on my mother's shoulder. They were so proud. If I did this, I would be destroying more than just Vance. I would be destroying the honor they thought I'd earned. I'd be a part of the biggest scandal in the history of the university. I might never get my degree. I might never work in this field again. I looked at Vance on the stage. He was staring at the control booth, waiting. He gave a tiny, impatient jerk of his head. "Do it, you little shit." That's what his eyes said. "Do what I told you." In that second, the last 4 years flashed before me. The 4 a.m. coffee, the typist comment, the stolen credit, the NDA he forced me to sign, the way he looked at the CEO of Pfizer like they were old friends while he treated me like a broken tool. He didn't just steal my work, he was trying to steal my right to exist as a scientist. I realized then that if I let him get away with this, I wouldn't be saving my parents' pride. I would be living a lie for the rest of my life. I would be the man who let a thief build a throne out of his bones. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my chest. The hesitation vanished. "Initializing now, Professor," I said into the microphone. I hit the key. The screens erupted into life. Millions of data points began to swirl. The cascade sequence began its climb. The audience gasped as the simulation accurately predicted a complex protein fold in seconds, a task that normally took weeks. "Look at that speed," Vance narrated, walking across the stage like a magician. "That is the power of the Vancore kernel. We are currently at 20% load. We are simulating the equivalent of 10,000 years of biological evolution every second." The stock ticker on the side of the screen began to move. VNCR, $82. VNCR, $95. I watched the load factor on my private monitor. 40%, 60%, 80%. Vance was peak performance now. He was telling a story about a child he'd met with a rare genetic disorder and how this software, his software, would save children like her. He was almost crying. The investors were practically reaching for their checkbooks in the dark. I looked at the ghost trigger counter. Current load, 92.4%. The room was silent, save for Vance's voice and the hum of the cooling fans I brought in for the extra servers. "We are approaching the final phase," Vance announced, his voice trembling with excitement. "In 60 seconds, we will complete the first ever full system map. This is the moment, ladies and gentlemen, the moment the world changes." Current load, 98.1%. I leaned back in my chair. I took a sip of my cold, bitter coffee. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating slow and steady. Current load, 99.1%. Vance stood in the center of the stage, arms spread wide, silhouetted against the glowing blue light of my stolen genius. And there, he whispered, the final fold. Current load 99.2% triggered. The screen didn't go black. It didn't crash. Instead, the beautiful blue proteins began to vibrate. They began to stretch and warp. They turned a sickly, bruised pupil. Vance's smile faltered. He stepped closer to the screen. As you can see, the complexity is, escalating as we reached the final stage. But the proteins weren't folding anymore. They were melting. They were turning into grotesque, jagged shapes that defied the laws of physics. They looked like digital tumors, growing and consuming one another. And then the text started to appear. It wasn't a pop-up window. It was hard-cutted into the visualization itself. Every protein strand was now made of tiny, glowing letters. Stolen, stolen, stolen. Vance froze. He looked like he'd been turned to stone. What? Kenji? What is this? Is this a glitch in the visualization? He stammered, his voice cracking. He turned toward the booth, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I didn't answer. I just watched. A massive block of text scrolled across the screen, overriding the simulation. It was the original time-stamped source code from 2021. It was my name, in 500-point font, flickering in bright neon red. The cascade sequences. Original architect Kenji Sato, property of Kumji Sato, property of the truth. The room exploded. People were standing up, shouting. The CEO of Pfizer walked out. The cameras from the financial news networks were zooming in on the screen, capturing every word of the logic bomb for the entire world to see. I looked at Vance. He looked small. For the first time, he looked like the fraud he was. The rock star was gone. There was just a scared middle-aged man standing in the ruins of a multi-billion-dollar lie. I looked at my parents. My father was standing up, looking at the screen, then back at the booth. He wasn't crying. He was looking at me. And for the first time in my life, he didn't look like he was proud of my assistance. He looked like he was proud of my fight. The silence that followed the initial uproar was even more deafening than the screaming. It was the sound of a $4 billion valuation evaporating in real time. On the monitors, the stock ticker for Vancore Tech, VNCR, didn't just drop. It fell off a cliff. $95, $60, $30, $12. Trading was suspended within 3 minutes, but by then, the damage was done. The logic bomb had just displayed my name. It had dumped a cryptographic hash of the entire original project folder onto the screen, providing a digital fingerprint that proved the code predated Vance's company by years. Vance was still on stage. He was hyperventilating. His expensive silk tie loosened, looking frantically at the wings of the stage for security or a technician to fix the glitch. But I had locked the terminal. I had encrypted the control booth from the inside. For the next 10 minutes, that screen belonged to me. People think my plan was just about the ghost code. They think I just wanted to embarrass him. But if that was all I did, Vance would have sued me into poverty. He would have used his lawyers to crush me for sabotage and corporate espionage. No, the real plan, the actual architecture of my revenge had started months ago, and it wasn't written in Python. It was written in the language of the university's own bylaws and the federal laws governing research grants. See, I knew Vance's greatest weakness, his laziness. He hadn't just stolen my code. He had used federal NIH, National Institutes of Health grant money to fund the private development of Vancore Tech. In the academic world, that is the cardinal sin. It's called grant fraud. If you use public money to create a private product without disclosing it, the government doesn't just fine you, they claw back every cent, and they bar you from ever receiving federal funds again. While I was playing the workhorse, in the lab, I was also playing the role of a meticulous whistleblower. Every time Vance told me to delete the local backups, I didn't. I moved them to an encrypted cold storage drive. Every time he sent me a cryptic email telling me to prioritize the venture over lab work, I saved the header data. I had spent my nights not just coding the ghost, but assembling a burn folder. It contained logs of every hour I spent working on Vancore code while being paid by a federal stipend. Audio recordings, legal, in my one-party consent state of Vance admitting he didn't care about the academic side and just wanted the IPO. The original source code with the 2021 timestamps, digitally notarized by a third-party service. But I couldn't just hand this to the dean. The dean was in Vance's pocket. I had to go bigger. 6 weeks before the demo, I had reached out to a very specific person, Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was Vance's oldest rival, a man who had been calling out Vance's flash over substance approach for a decade. Thorne was also on the university's ethics oversight committee. I didn't go to him as a student. I went to him as a source. I have the receipts, Dr. Thorne. I told him in a dimly lit corner of the campus library. I have proof of grant commingling, intellectual property theft, and falsification of data. Thorne had looked at the files for 10 minutes before his hands started to shake. Kenji, if this is real, Julian isn't just finished. He's headed for a federal indictment. It's real, I said, but I need a guarantee. I want my PhD. I want my work back, and I want to be the one to press the button. We struck a deal. Thorne worked behind the scenes with the university's legal counsel, the real legal counsel, the ones who cared about the school's reputation more than Vance's ego. They realized that if they protected Vance, they would lose all their federal funding when the scandal eventually broke. They had to cut him loose to save themselves. So, while Vance was preparing his coronation, the university was secretly preparing his execution. They had given me the pre-defense seminar slot specifically because it gave me a platform that was being live-streamed to the world. They wanted the exposure to be so massive that no one could claim they tried to cover it up. As the chaos in the grand hall peaked, the side doors opened. 4 men in dark suits, not Vance's security, but university police and federal agents, walked toward the stage. Vance saw them. He finally stopped looking at the screen and looked at the men. His face went from white to a translucent, sickly gray. He tried to speak, but only a dry, wheezing sound came out. Julian Vance, the lead officer said, his voice cutting through the noise. We have a warrant for the seizure of all Vancore Tech servers and a summons for your appearance before the Board of Regents. Please step away from the podium. Vance looked at the audience. He looked at the investors who were now screaming into their phones, trying to sell their worthless shares. He looked at the dean, who was suddenly very busy looking at his own shoes. And then, finally, he looked at me. I stood up in the control booth. I turned on the house lights. I wasn't hiding anymore. I walked down the stairs, through the crowd that parted like the Red Sea, and stood at the base of the stage. I was still wearing my wrinkled lab coat. I still had the smell of the lab on me, but I felt like I was 10 feet tall. The simulation is over, Julian, I said. My voice was amplified by the speakers echoing throughout the hall. The engine has stopped. He looked down at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, desperate rage. You little. I made you. You were nothing. I gave you a future. No, I said, shaking my head. You gave me a cage. I built my own future. And I built it on the one thing you forgot to include in your architecture. What? He spat, spittle flying from his lips. The truth, I said. It's surprisingly hard to compile, but once it runs, it's impossible to stop. As the agents led him off the stage, the crowd began to turn on him. It wasn't a scientific debate anymore, it was a mob. The visionary was being hauled away like a common thief, and the typist was left standing in the light. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. It was my father. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and took my hand, squeezing it with a strength I didn't know he still had. My mother was behind him, wiping her eyes, a small, proud smile on her face. But the work wasn't done. The plan had one final stage, because while Vance was losing his company, I was about to gain something much more valuable. I looked over at Dr. Thorne, who was standing by the exit. He gave me a sharp, professional nod. The university had already agreed. because the work was proven to be mine, and because I had acted as the whistleblower for the grant fraud. My PhD would be fast-tracked through a different department. My name would be the sole patent holder on the cascade sequence. I wasn't just Kenji Sato, the student, anymore. I was Dr. Sato, and the code was finally coming home. The immediate aftermath of the logic bomb was a hurricane of litigation, panic, and pure, unadulterated chaos. While the federal agents led Vance out through the service entrance to avoid the literal mob of angry investors forming at the front, I stayed in the hall. I had to. The servers were still humming, and the ghosts was still scrolling the truth across the screens. Vance didn't go quietly into the night. Within 48 hours, he had hired a crisis management legal team that cost more per hour than my father made in a month. They tried to spin the narrative. They claimed I was a disgruntled, mentally unstable student who had hacked the system to sabotage a genius's breakthrough. They tried to file an emergency injunction to seize my encrypted drives, claiming I was holding the future of medicine hostage, but they were bringing a knife to a nuclear dogfight. 3 days after the seminar, I was called into a closed-door hearing with the University Board of Regents and a representative from the Department of Justice. Vance was there. He wasn't in his bespoke suit anymore. He looked disheveled, his eyes sunken, his skin a sallow, sickly yellow. He sat across from me at the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked like they were carved out of ice. "Mr. Sato," one of the lawyers began, his voice dripping with condescending silk, "we are prepared to offer you a settlement, 7 figures, a full PhD from a university of your choice. In exchange, you will sign a document stating that the code was a collaborative effort, and you will hand over the decryption keys to the Van Core Master Branch." I looked at the check they slid across the table. It was for $5 million. I looked at Vance. For the first time in years, he looked hopeful. He actually leaned forward, his hands trembling on the table. "Kenji, be smart," he whispered. "We can still save this. Think of the science. Think of the patients. Don't let your ego destroy the cure for cancer." The sheer breathtaking gall of it made me laugh. It wasn't a bitter laugh this time. It was a laugh of pure disbelief. "The science?" I asked. "Julian, you don't even know how to compile the kernel. You couldn't explain the recursive loop at line 402 if I gave you a week in a textbook. You didn't care about the cure. You cared about the ticker symbol. We have witnesses who saw Dr. Vance designing the architecture," the lawyer snapped. "And I have the Git logs," I countered, pulling a folder from my bag. "I have every commit message from the last 4 years. I have the IP addresses. I have the metadata. And most importantly, I have the logic bomb source code itself." I leaned forward, looking Vance straight in the eye. "Every time you told me to delete a backup, I made 3 more. Every time you used grant money, grant number R01-GM12345, specifically to pay for your private servers," I logged the timestamp. "The DOJ isn't here to talk about collaboration, Julian. They're here because you stole from the American taxpayer to line your own pockets." The lawyers started to speak, but the DOJ representative, a woman named Miller who looked like she'd never smiled in her life, held up a hand. "We've already verified Mr. Sato's logs," Miller said. Her voice was like a gavel. "The forensic audit of the lab's server history shows a consistent pattern of intellectual property misappropriation and federal fund commingling. Dr. Vance, your tenure is being revoked by the university as of 10 minutes ago. Your assets have been frozen, and we are currently preparing a formal indictment for 18 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny." The color drained from Vance's face until he was the color of a mushroom. He looked at his lawyers. They didn't look back. They were already checking their watches, realizing the billable hours were about to dry up. "Kenji," Vance stammered, you're destroying a legacy." "No," I said, standing up. "I'm just reclaiming mine." The fallout was a scorched earth event for the department. 3 other professors who had looked the other way while Vance played the game were forced into early retirement. The dean resigned to spend more time with family. Vancore Tech went from a $4 billion unicorn to a punchline on Jim Cramer in 72 hours. The company declared bankruptcy, and the liquidation of its assets, ironically, reverted the patents back to the university and the original inventor, me. But the most satisfying moment didn't happen in a boardroom or a courtroom. It happened in the basement lab, 2 weeks later. I was there to pack up my things. The lab was officially sealed as a crime scene, but I had special permission to retrieve my personal belongings. The air was still, the servers finally quiet. The ozone smell was gone, replaced by the scent of industrial cleaning fluid. As I was putting my old stained coffee mug into a box, I saw a figure at the door. It was Vance. He'd been out on bail, pending his trial. He looked like a ghost. He was wearing an old track jacket and jeans. The rock star was dead. I just wanted to know one thing, he said. His voice was raspy. Why the ghost? Why 99.2%? I taped the box shut, because that's the moment of maximum pride, Julian. That's the point where you think you finally won. I wanted you to feel the floor vanish, exactly when you were sure you were standing on top of the world. I would have made you rich, he said, but there was no conviction in it. It was a reflex. I'm already rich, I said, picking up my box. I have my name back. I have my work back. And I don't ever have to hear you say fever dream again. I walked past him. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the sound of his breathing, heavy, ragged, and entirely alone. Outside, the sun was shining. The campus was full of students, most of them younger than me, all of them chasing their own versions of the future. I walked across the quad, the weight of the box in my arms feeling lighter than anything I'd carried in years. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. Dr. Sato, your mother has cooked your favorite dinner. Don't be late. I smiled. The quad model student was gone. The workhorse was dead. And for the first time in my life, the engine was running on my terms. The dust didn't settle overnight, but when it did, the landscape of my life looked entirely different. The scandal, now known in academic circles as the Vance collapse, became a case study taught in ethics classes across the country. But for me, it wasn't a case study. It was the beginning of a long overdue exhale. 3 months after the demo, I stood in a small, wood-paneled room. There were no LED screens, no cameras, and no champagne. Just me, Dr. Thorne, and 3 other professors from the revamped Ethics and Bioengineering Committee. This was my real defense. It lasted 4 hours. They grilled me on every line of the cascade sequence, every recursive loop, every biological assumption. And for the first time, I wasn't defending someone else's vision. I was explaining my own. When I finished, Dr. Thorne stood up, walked around the table, and shook my hand. Congratulations, Dr. Sato, he said. The work is impeccable, and integrity, that's something we can't teach, but you've mastered it. I walked out of that room and called my parents. My mother picked up on the first ring. I didn't say much. I just said, Mom, I'm a doctor. I heard her sob on the other end, a sound of pure, unburdened relief. My father took the phone, his voice steady but thick with emotion. You did it the right way, Kenji. That is what matters. But I didn't stay in academia. I'd had enough of the ivory tower for one lifetime. I realized that the problem wasn't just Vance. It was a system that allowed people like him to thrive by cannibalizing the people below them. I used the patents that had been rightfully returned to me to start something new. I didn't call it Sato Tech. I didn't want my name on a building. I called it OpenFold. It was a nonprofit foundation dedicated to open-source biological simulations. If Vance wanted to turn a cure into a billion-dollar IPO, I was going to make it free for every researcher on the planet. I made the core Cascade kernel public. Anyone with a laptop and an internet connection could use it to study cancer, Alzheimer's, or rare genetic disorders. People told me I was crazy. You're sitting on a gold mine, Kenji, a former investor of Vance's told me over coffee. You could be the next billionaire. I've seen what that kind of money does to the science, I told him. I'd rather be the guy who fixed the problem than the guy who owned the solution. Vance's trial was a slow-motion car crash. He tried to claim he was mentally incompetent due to the stress of the IPO. He tried to blame the toxic culture of the university. It didn't work. The evidence I gathered was too clean, too chronological, too undeniable. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for grant fraud and money laundering. The last photo I saw of him was a grainy shot in a local paper. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, his silver hair unkempt, looking confused and remarkably ordinary. He wasn't a rock star anymore. He was just an inmate. My life now is quiet, and I love it. I have a small lab in a converted warehouse. I hire grad students, but I pay them a living wage, and I make sure their names are first on every paper we publish. We have a rule: no one works past 6 p.m. No one lives on coffee and desperation. We do the work because we love the puzzles, not because we're chasing a ticker symbol. Every now and then, I look at the old server logs from that 4 a.m. night in the lab. I keep them as a reminder of who I used to be, the kid who was afraid to speak up, the workhorse who thought his only value was his output. I'm still meticulous. I'm still a coder at heart. But I've learned that the most important code we ever write isn't the stuff that runs on a silicon chip. It's the code we live by, the logic of our own lives. Vance thought he could delete me. He thought he could overwrite my existence with his own ambition. But he forgot the most basic rule of engineering. A system built on a lie will always fail under pressure. 1 year after the collapse, I received a package in the mail. It was a bound copy of my thesis, officially filed in the university library. I opened the first page. There, in the acknowledgments, I had written a single line: "To the engines that keep running, even when no one is watching, your time is coming." I closed the book and set it on my shelf. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. My team was already gone for the day. The lab was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began to type. Input, start new simulation. Status, ready. Architect, Dr. Kenji Sato. The progress bar began to move. It hit 10%, 50%, 90%, and then it hit 100%. No glitches, no ghosts, just the data. Just the truth.